Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Brett Ryan. Brett Ryan was raised in a loving and prosperous Canadian family with 3 brothers. His parents, Bill and Susan, set a positive example and taught their children valuable life lessons. Bill worked at the Toronto Star daily newspaper and had diverse interests, while Susan managed the household and cared for her family without outside help. The whole family admired Susan, who showed equal love to all her sons. Although Brett seemed to get in trouble less often, it was because he had a talent for talking his way out of difficult situations. He was charismatic and well-liked by his peers. Brett's charm earned him many friends in school, and he went on to attend university after high school. However, he felt pressure to outdo his brothers, so he started a house painting business in the local newspaper. Initially, he did well and made his mother proud, but eventually he realized that it wasn't as fulfilling as he thought and had to drop out of university to focus on it. As his brothers graduated and found jobs, Brett stayed behind with his parents and younger brother, accumulating debt and struggling with depression. By 2007, his debt had reached $60,000, and he struggled to manage his finances, hiding his troubles behind volunteer work and kindness. Desperate and broke, Brett decided to rob a bank on October 28, 2007. He disguised himself with old clothes, a hat, and a scarf that covered his face, and limped into the bank on the outskirts of his neighborhood. After threatening a bank employee, he left with just over $1,000, realizing he would need to rob many more banks to settle his debts. After his first robbery, he was worried that the police would catch up with him, so he avoided going home for a few days. He told his mother he had a job in a nearby town and spent his nights sleeping in his car, periodically sneaking back to his house to check if the police were watching. Fortunately, everything seemed quiet, and no one was looking for him, which made him feel like he was doing things right. As he continued to rob banks, Brett changed his appearance each time. He stopped wearing his old clothes and instead bought second-hand ones or found them in the trash. After each heist, he would burn the clothes he wore. He also bought a fake beard from a costume store to disguise himself. The bank employees he threatened always remembered the bearded man, which helped to create a false identity. The Toronto newspapers wrote about the bearded robber, but Brett never made a large sum of money from his crimes. The most he stole was $3,000. Eventually, his luck ran out, and the police spotted his car on surveillance cameras, following him all the way home. By then, they still didn't have concrete evidence to prove his guilt, so they decided to keep an eye on the suspect. For 15 days, Brett didn't commit any robberies, which was unusual since he typically struck every 3 or 4 days. The police were starting to think they had the wrong guy and were wasting their time. However, their luck changed when Brett left his house, got into a car, and later got out near a bank wearing a disguise. He entered the bank, stayed for a bit, and when he tried to exit, the police were waiting to arrest him. After months of searching, they finally caught the notorious bearded robber. Brett was investigated for 7 months and charged with armed robbery. Interestingly, despite having a permit to carry a gun, Brett never brought a weapon with him during his robberies, not even a kitchen knife. Brett was arrested and faced 19 charges, leading to a prison sentence. He, along with his family, filed multiple appeals, which resulted in 11 charges being dropped. Once eligible, Brett applied for parole and submitted a petition. In it, he explained that he had committed the crimes while struggling with severe depression, resulting from 2 failed relationships and significant debt. Brett emphasized that he had not used weapons and had no intention of harming anyone during the crimes. The parole board accepted his remarks, but required him to undergo a psychological evaluation. This had a positive impact on Brett, and he took the opportunity to reconnect with his family, with whom he had not communicated while incarcerated. The parole board noticed the positive changes in Brett and granted him early release on November 24, 2010. However, his newfound freedom was bittersweet and even more challenging than before. Before his imprisonment, Brett was a painter carrying emotional burdens. After his release, he was a bank robber and ex-convict with a tarnished reputation. After the robbery incident, Brett struggled to find a job due to his notorious reputation. Even people who initially hired him for house painting services would cancel once they recognized him as the bearded robber. To make matters worse, their neighbors, who once admired Susan's garden and frequently visited, began spreading unpleasant rumors about the family. As a result, the Ryan family decided to sell their house and move to Scarborough. In their new location, Susan started a new garden and Brett managed to find a job at a trading company, although his salary was not high. Fortunately, his parents were able to support him financially as he worked to rebuild his university education. Brett continued to see a psychologist who consistently advised him to maintain a close relationship with his family. This advice proved to be valuable. Despite this, Brett's financial situation remained a challenge. However, his life took a positive turn in September 2011 when he met Kristen Baxter, a wonderful young woman who owned an apartment with a beautiful sea view. She maintained a healthy lifestyle through sports and didn't concern herself with Brett's past. The couple enjoyed traveling together, including a trip to Australia. Brett's parents were thrilled to see their son happy and believed Kristen would encourage him to reach his full potential and become a responsible member of society. Brett's life was improving, but an unexpected event occurred that threatened to derail his progress. His father's sudden passing was a devastating blow, and Brett's depression began to resurface. To cope, he increased his visits to a psychologist and devoted more time to supporting his mother financially, although his own funds were limited. As their long-term relationship evolved, Brett knew it was time to take a significant step. No longer just careless teenagers, the young couple needed to build a life together. Deeply in love with Kristen, Brett decided to make a heartfelt proposal. He had saved up some money and discussed his plans with his mother, wanting to make the proposal unforgettable and impossible for Kristen to refuse. Susan understood what her son Brett was hinting at, so she gave him money to buy an engagement ring for his girlfriend Kristen. Previously, the couple had discussed their future together, and Kristen didn't need an extravagant gift to prove Brett's commitment. However, Brett wanted to make a grand gesture and purchased a gold ring with a large diamond for her. Needless to say, Kristen accepted his proposal. Once engaged, the couple began making wedding plans. Brett agreed with Kristen's decisions, but he was shocked by how expensive everything was and how it made him worried about his job security. This motivated him to find a well-paying job to support their future together. He discovered an engineering job opening at a large tech company, created a resume, and applied for the position. After a successful interview, he got the job, which thrilled him. Brett excitedly shared the news with Kristen and his mother, and he even asked his mother for money to buy a fancy suit for his new job. Brett's mother had agreed to buy him a suit for a job interview. However, just after the purchase, the company called to inform him that his application was rejected due to his criminal past, which the security service had discovered. Brett was devastated by the news and felt like giving up. He questioned the point of continuing with the interview process if no one wanted to hire an ex-criminal, regardless of his attempts to reform. Disheartened, Brett decided to abandon his university studies and instead use the money his mother and brothers had given him to finance his wedding to Kristen. He didn't inform his family or counselor about his decision to drop out of university, nor did he share the news about being rejected for the engineering job. Brett created a false image of himself as a successful businessman. He'd dress up in a suit and tie, then change into painting clothes on his way to work. He lied to his relatives, telling them he worked in an office, and supported this fiction by posting photos on social media that he downloaded from the internet. When he was with his family, Brett would often pretend to receive important work calls, making excuses to take care of urgent business matters. He was skilled at deceiving those around him, and no one suspected that he was actually just a house painter. In September 2016, Brett's 5-year relationship with Kristen was nearing its climax as they planned their wedding. He even agreed to rent an expensive restaurant that would cost $100 per guest. The Ryan family was overjoyed, believing that Brett had finally turned his life around, with a prestigious job, a fancy apartment, and a beautiful fiancée. Brett's lies had spiraled out of control, and there was no escape from the consequences. With the wedding only a month away, he had invested heavily in the event. To foot the bill, he repeatedly borrowed money from his mother, and when she could no longer help, he shamelessly demanded that she get a better-paying job. Around the same time, he planned an extravagant bachelor party in August, inviting all his friends and brothers. As his web of lies began to unravel, Brett confided in his counselor about the situation. For a year, he had deceived his family into believing he worked as an engineer for a technology company. The psychologist was dismayed that his longtime client had gone astray again and advised Brett to confess everything to his mother. After much contemplation and procrastination, Brett finally came clean to her. His mother was outraged, having proudly told everyone about her supposed wonderful son. She insisted that Brett reveal the truth to Kristen, threatening to expose him herself if he didn't comply. Moreover, she warned him that his brothers were already aware of the situation and sided with her. Brett couldn't muster the courage to confess to Kristen, having struggled to tell the truth to his mother in the first place. Brett knew the wedding was only a month away, but he remained silent about his lies, even though it would be better for Kristen to know the truth beforehand. He was unsure what he was hoping to achieve by keeping quiet, but he couldn't shake the thought that his mother might expose him to Kristen, causing a scandal. Every time Kristen's phone rang, Brett's heart skipped a beat, fearing it was his mother calling to reveal his secrets. He breathed a sigh of relief when it was just a friend inquiring about the wedding plans. Desperate to stop his mother from interfering, Brett hatched a sinister plan. Because he was not allowed to use firearms due to his previous robbery conviction, he decided to use a crossbow, a silent and deadly weapon. Brett had learned how to shoot a crossbow from his late father, who used to practice target shooting in their garden. Though his father had taught him well, he never intended for Brett to use this skill for harm. Brett purchased the crossbow and arrows from a sporting goods store and hid them away, preparing to carry out his disturbing plan. Brett created an alibi to deceive others into thinking he was at home all day. He rigged a fan to turn on at a set time, which then moved a spoon across his computer keyboard, automatically posting pre-written comments on YouTube videos. On August 25th, Brett dressed in disguise to conceal his identity and left his house through the back door to avoid detection by security cameras. He took a train to his parents' house, intent on taking care of anyone who might threaten his and Kristen's well-being. When Brett arrived unexpectedly at his parents' house, his mother Susan was taken aback. Despite her poor health that day, Brett persisted in trying to convince her not to tell Kristen anything, eventually becoming angry and aggressive. Susan sensed something was wrong and, intimidated by her son's intense behavior, warned him that she had already called Christopher and he was on his way to their location. Brett's anger and adrenaline surged out of control as he ran to the garage to grab a crossbow. However, his emotional state prevented him from making a clear shot, so he instead used the butt of the gun to bludgeon his mother. To ensure she was dead, he placed plastic bags over her body and tightened a rope around her neck. Brett then loaded the crossbow with arrows and hid in the bushes, waiting for his brother Christopher to arrive. When Christopher called out for their mother or brother, Brett shot him in the neck from behind, causing his death within minutes. Susan, their mother, had also called their youngest brother Alexander, who was also shot in the neck, but the arrow didn't go deep enough, and he began screaming for help. Throughout the chaos, Leland was oblivious to the violence unfolding in the garage and garden, unaware that his own brother was committing the crimes. He slept in his second-floor room until a scream disturbed him. Rushing downstairs, Leland found Brett trying to strangle Alexander, and a fierce fight broke out between the two brothers. Once Leland gained the upper hand, he pushed Brett aside and ran to the neighbors to call the police. Brett realized he was trapped in the house with no escape, overwhelmed by the consequences of his actions. He acknowledged that he had ruined his life and there was no turning back. He took out his phone and wrote a letter to Kristen, begging for her forgiveness. When the police arrived, they found Brett sitting next to his brother Alexander, both of them covered in blood. Despite his injuries, Alexander was still alive, but later succumbed to his wounds in the hospital. Brett voluntarily handed himself over to the police, asking to be handcuffed and taken to the station. There, he confessed to the crimes and revealed the location of his mother's body, hidden under packages in the garage. He expressed regret, stating that he had never intended to kill Susan, only to scare her. However, he had planned to kill Christopher and Alexander, using them as witnesses to his twisted scheme. If they hadn't arrived that day, they would still be alive, just like they had been nearly 10 years prior. Brett attempted to justify his actions by citing his depression, but it didn't lessen his punishment. Despite confessing to the crimes without resistance and cooperating with the investigation, he received 3 life sentences, 1 for each murder. He will be eligible for parole in 2041. Leland, the sole survivor of the tragedy, has declined to speak to the press, but he is well known in Toronto for his traumatic experience. The case of Paula Salazar. Paula Salazar was born on September 6, 2015, in Venezuela to Andrina Bermudos Millian from Matarina, Monagas, and Leonardo Salazar from Tucupito, Delta Amacuro. In 2016, Paula's parents decided to move to Ecuador with their 1-year-old daughter, seeking a better life. They settled in Quito, the capital city, but their relationship began to deteriorate due to various reasons. After a month, Andrina broke up with Leonardo and moved to Cuenca, Ecuador's 3rd largest city, with Paula. They stayed with her best friend's mother while looking for a new place to live and work. Meanwhile, Leonardo returned to his hometown of Tucupito, Venezuela, following the breakup. Later, he immigrated again, this time to Trinidad and Tobago. Leonardo had been living with a disability for a long time, the result of a motorcycle accident in his youth that left his left arm completely paralyzed. This made it difficult for him to find a good job, even in Ecuador's capital city. After Andrina moved to Cuenca, she rarely contacted Leonardo, except to tell him that she had found a job on a farm in Tapacundo. A few months later, she started a new romantic relationship with Washington Andreas Aymaro, the wealthy owner of the farm where she worked. Andrina and Andreas had a child together in 2019. With their new baby, the family seemed happier and more united than ever. However, their lives took a dramatic turn on March 27, 2020. On that day, Andreas took Paula to the flower plantations by car, but during the trip, Paula suddenly became very sick, feeling dizzy and vomiting. Andreas was forced to stop at a public restroom to tend to her. Andreas and the 4-year-old girl Paula entered a room where Paula vomited again. Andreas left her alone for a few minutes to get a change of clothes from the car, as her clothes were dirty. When he returned, he found Paula lying with her head in the toilet bowl. He pulled her out, tried to give her first aid, and rushed her to the hospital. Despite his efforts, Paula showed no signs of life when doctors examined her. The doctors pronounced Paula dead and immediately noticed inconsistencies in Andreas' story. They saw that Paula had bruises on her body and face that couldn't have occurred as Andreas described. Following medical protocol, the doctors contacted the police, who arrived shortly and arrested Andreas as a suspect in Paula's murder. Andreas claimed Paula had drowned in the toilet bowl, but the autopsy revealed a darker truth. The tests showed that Paula had been dead for about 24 hours before arriving at the hospital, contradicting Andreas's version of events. Paula's foster father alleged that he provided her with first aid and CPR, and that these efforts took place just 20 minutes before he brought her to the hospital. However, the autopsy revealed that Paula had suffered multiple broken ribs, various microtraumas, a cracked spine, and sepsis, which ultimately led to her death. The autopsy findings were alarming, as Paula's small body showed evidence of numerous injuries, both recent and old. The evidence suggested that her death was not accidental. Paula's biological father, Leonardo Salazar, discovered the tragic news 33 days after her death, when his mother in Venezuela called to inform him of the loss, having learned of it herself from a friend of Andreina's. After Leonardo left Ecuador, Andreina began a new relationship and cut off all communication with him. This is why he didn't hear about his daughter Paula's tragedy for 3 days. The only way he found out about her was through pictures sent by Andreina and their mutual friends. Andreina even blocked him on social media, preventing him from contacting Paula, and cut off ties with most of Leonardo's relatives. Andreina turned their mutual friends against Leonardo by telling them that he didn't want to communicate with Paula. However, it was Andreina's family who eventually informed Leonardo of Paula's death, claiming that she died from COVID-19 complications. But Leonardo was skeptical, as there were very few coronavirus deaths in Ecuador at the time. He started researching the statistics and noticed that there were no child victims of the coronavirus in Ecuador. Leonardo's relatives helped him investigate, and they soon found a newspaper article about Andreina's arrest on suspicion of killing Paula. When Leonardo confronted Andreina about this, she coldly told him that Paula died from diseases and couldn't provide more information due to her lawyer's advice. Leonardo then created a Facebook page and an Instagram profile dedicated to Paula, seeking justice for her death. The posts caused a huge backlash on social media, and people in Andreina's circle began contacting Leonardo, sharing information about Paula's sad life. They sent him recordings, photos, and audio recordings that revealed the abuse Paula suffered at the hands of her stepfather and Andreina. According to witnesses, Paula was constantly depressed, shy, and frightened in the presence of her stepfather. She even confessed to being beaten by Andreina and her stepfather as punishment. Paula called her stepfather a monster and was terrified of him. She suffered from insomnia and nightmares, and her mother forced her to cook and take care of herself from a very young age. Andreina's mistreatment of Paula eventually led to her death, and Leonardo was determined to bring her to justice. At the preschool Paula attended, she constantly complained of leg and back pain, and often said she couldn't walk. The teachers also noticed bruises on her body. They took her to the health center for an examination, and the doctors concluded that Paula was being mistreated by her family. The teachers then reported the abuse to a special police organization, which launched an investigation. As a result, Paula was temporarily placed in the care of her uncle, Andreina's brother, on October 16, 2019, while the investigation continued. A hearing was scheduled for December 4, 2019, but the teachers who were supposed to testify failed to show up. The hearing was rescheduled for February 27, 2020, but again, the teachers didn't appear. Without their testimony, the court had to drop the charges against Paula's parents, and she was returned to her mother on March 27th. Tragically, Paula died soon after. It is suspected that Andreina may have bribed the teachers or convinced them that Paula's parents were not responsible for her abuse. After Paula's death, Andreina was placed in protective custody, but she appealed this decision. At a hearing on June 12, 2020, the judge set a restraining order and released Andreina to house arrest. Meanwhile, Paula's father, Leonardo, was campaigning on social media and raising funds to travel from Trinidad and Tobago to Ecuador to file a complaint against Andreina. With the help of 2 Ecuadorian lawyers, Oswaldo and Alejandro, Leonardo was able to travel to Ecuador and file a complaint against Andreina. Leonardo's journey was extremely difficult due to closed borders and restricted travel. He had to take a raft, cross treacherous terrain, and used private transfers to reach Ecuador. On June 30th, he arrived in Quito and met with a lawyer to file his complaint. On July 6, 2020, Andreina was charged with Paula's murder, and the court ruled that she could remain under house arrest, reporting to justice twice a week. Both Andreina and her partner, Andreas, were charged with murder, which carries a maximum sentence of 13 years in prison. In November 2020, a hearing was held to set a trial date. During the hearing, Leonardo's lawyer expressed concern that Andreina might escape, given her previous suicide attempt. They requested that Andreina be fitted with an electronic monitoring bracelet, which the judge granted. A hearing was held on November 16th to reassess previous decisions. Although this process slowed down the trial, the judge managed to set a date for December. Despite limited media coverage, information about the trial of Andreas and Andreina spread through social media. The COVID-19 pandemic dominated the news, causing some details to go unreported. The trial began on January 14, 2021, but a decision on Andreina's alternative imprisonment options had not been made, and Andreas was still being held at the regional detention center. The trial was held in private, without media representatives present. Some participants joined via video link. The doctor who performed the autopsy on Paula revealed disturbing details. Paula had undergone extensive spinal reconstruction, had broken ribs that had healed on their own, and had signs of previous injuries. The autopsy also showed that Paula had nail stigmata, a condition where nails grow into the skin, as well as facial and bodily bruises and scratches, fluid buildup in her lungs, head scars, and intestinal lacerations. The assessment found that Paula's later injuries led to an infection, which gradually worsened into sepsis and ultimately caused her death. The autopsy report revealed that Paula had been dead for around 24 hours by the time Andreas took her to the hospital. The extent of her internal and external injuries shockingly demonstrated the extreme cruelty she suffered and the gross neglect by her guardians, who had never sought medical attention for her. Additionally, Paula was severely malnourished, underweight, and small for her age, with deficiencies in essential minerals and nutrients. In an attempt to downplay her role in Paula's abuse, her mother, Andreina, claimed that Paula had psychological problems, implying that the child's injuries were self-inflicted as a way to seek attention. The girl's mother testified that after her brother's birth, Paula felt neglected, stopped sleeping at night, and tried to control everyone by crying. Contrary to the decision of the authorities, Paula continued to live with her parents in October 2019, only spending a few nights at her uncle's house. This failed arrangement was linked to the abuse Paula suffered, which began in 2017, shortly after Leonardo left Ecuador. The mistreatment likely started when Andreina began a relationship with Andreas. More than 40 witnesses testified in court, confirming that Paula was a victim of abuse for at least 3 years of her short life. At the final court hearing, Andreina took full responsibility for abusing Paula, claiming she alone was responsible for the child's injuries. She admitted to physically punishing Paula with a belt and her fists. By doing so, Andreina attempted to exonerate her partner, stating he was innocent and had no involvement in the abuse. Andreina also revealed that she punished Paula because the child's presence was causing problems in her new relationship. She feared that if she broke up with her new husband, she would lose financial stability and be forced back onto the streets. As a result, caring for Paula was her lowest priority. After learning about Paula's background, the judges were concerned about the well-being of the couple's newborn son, but it's clear that he was not abused like Paula was. Andreas has consistently exercised his right to remain silent, making no statements about the incident since his arrest. By February 3, 2021, Paula's trial had concluded and the couple was sentenced. Both were found guilty of murdering the girl with a maximum sentence of 13 years. The original attorneys and the prosecution demanded the maximum punishment, but the chief judge considered an aggravating factor. Paula's age, just 4 years old, made her vulnerable and unable to defend herself. As a result, the judge sentenced Andreina and Andreas to 17 years and 4 months in prison. Under Ecuadorian law, the convicted couple had 3 days to appeal the verdict, which they were expected to do immediately. Although Andreina received a 17-year sentence, she remained on house arrest and didn't go to jail, as she exercised her right to appeal. Now a higher court must confirm her sentence for incarceration. She is still cooperating with the authorities, following the original guidelines. However, Andreas was arrested when he arrived at the hospital with a deceased girl. The fact that Andreina remains at large is causing widespread outrage and anger, particularly for Leonardo, who is concerned that she might use this opportunity to evade justice. The case of Alicia Ross. Alicia Ross was born on February 8, 1980, in Markham, Ontario, Canada, to biological parents who relinquished their rights to the child. She was adopted by Marvin and Sharon Ross, who provided her with love and care. Despite her adoptive parents' divorce, they maintained a friendly relationship and continued to support Alicia. Alicia excelled in school, particularly in drawing and photography. She had a passion for traveling and exploring new cities and countries. After finishing school, she spent a year in Australia before returning home and enrolling in university. In the summer of 2005, Alicia went on a hiking trip in the mountains where she met her boyfriend, Sean Heighten. On August 16th, Alicia went for a walk in the park with her adoptive mother and their dogs. She seemed happy and shared that she was expecting a promotion at work to the position of senior sales manager. Alicia was proud of her achievement and expressed her desire to introduce Sean to her adoptive parents. That evening, Alicia and Sean went on a date, and after returning home, they had a great time together. Around midnight, Sean left Alicia's house, promising to call her as soon as he got home. When he called around midnight, Alicia didn't pick up the phone. Sean wasn't overly concerned, thinking she had simply fallen asleep. Sean tried to call Alicia again the next morning, but when she didn't answer, he began to worry. Unbeknownst to him, Alicia had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a mysterious disappearance that would puzzle investigators and her family for years to come. When Alicia didn't pick up, Sean became genuinely worried and contacted a mutual acquaintance who worked in the same office as Ross. From him, Sean learned that Alicia hadn't come to work, and he immediately rushed to her house on the morning of August 17th. Sharon and Julius, Alicia's parents, were planning to play golf with friends and left the house around 10 a.m. They noticed Alicia's car in the driveway, but thought little of it, assuming a colleague had picked her up. About half an hour later, Sean arrived at the Ross residence and found no sign of Alicia. He called the police to report her missing and also contacted Sharon, informing her of the situation. The police were already present when Sharon and Julius arrived home, alarmed by the news. Sean was the first person to notice Alicia's disappearance and inform the authorities. Moreover, he was the last person to see her alive and well the evening before she vanished. According to him, they had said goodbye at the gate where his car was parked around midnight, and she hadn't been in touch since then. When Sharon approached Alicia's room, she immediately noticed that all her daughter's personal belongings, without which she never left the house, were in their places. Her purse, passport, driver's license, keys, cell phone, bank cards, and cash were all left in the room, indicating she wouldn't have gone anywhere, let alone left without them. The gate was open, but not forced, suggesting that the missing person either let her abductor in herself or willingly left with someone. In the backyard, the police found some disorder. The lawn and flowers were trampled as if someone had fallen there. A pair of cigarettes and the right sandal of the girl, which she had been wearing the evening before, were found on the ground, laid out in a straight line. Neither Alicia nor her parents smoked, so the cigarettes didn't belong to them, and Sean claimed he never smoked that particular brand. Sean was almost immediately considered the prime suspect. Firstly, he was noticeably nervous, and his account seemed somewhat confused and disjointed. Secondly, he was the first to report Alicia's disappearance to the police, even before speaking with her parents and confirming that they too had not seen her. Additionally, law enforcement found biological traces on the girl's bed belonging to both her and Sean. Based on this, the investigation speculated that Alicia might have denied Sean intimacy, and he decided to force her, then trying to cover his tracks and stage her disappearance, which he likely caused by ending her life. When Sean was brought to the station, questioned, and the investigator's theory presented to him, he was stunned. He was dismayed to be the prime suspect and swore he would never harm his girlfriend, as he loved her. He also admitted that they did indeed have intimate moments that evening, but insisted it was consensual. The missing girl's parents also had nothing bad to say about Sean. He hadn't argued with their daughter, hadn't mistreated her, and she spoke only well of him. Their relationship was progressing rapidly and quite happily, so much so that Alicia even hoped to have a future with him. The police were baffled by the disappearance of a young woman, Alicia, who had no reason to leave her life behind. She was awaiting a promotion at her job and was a responsible person, so it was unlikely she would just vanish without a word. If something unexpected had happened, she would have contacted her parents. Yet, she had left without her documents, money, and phone. The police questioned her boyfriend Sean, but lacked enough evidence to detain him. They didn't rule him out as a suspect, though, and kept an eye on him. Sean seemed depressed and upset, and the massive search effort began the day after Alicia's disappearance. The police thoroughly inspected her home and yard, questioned neighbors, and examined the surrounding area. However, no one reported seeing or hearing anything suspicious that night. The police theorized that Alicia vanished between midnight and sunrise, a time when the streets are usually quiet. Flyers with Alicia's photo were distributed throughout the city, and her story was featured in the news, generating significant public interest. The police received dozens of calls daily, but most information turned out to be false or mistaken. Sean participated in the search efforts, despite being the prime suspect, and even gave a media interview, pleading for help and displaying photos of the happy couple. The search for Alicia expanded to include abandoned buildings, wooded areas, and wastelands. Her parents, believing she was alive and being held against her will, appealed to the public for help. The police suspected someone close to Alicia might be involved, possibly killing her, due to the lack of signs of struggle or forced entry. Despite their efforts, no concrete leads were found, and the case remained a mystery. 2 weeks after Alicia's disappearance, Sean was arrested on an unrelated charge of driving under the influence and resisting arrest. This led to speculation that he was drowning his guilt in alcohol. Alicia's parents gave another interview, revealing they had only known Sean through their daughter's accounts and didn't know him personally. They considered the possibility that Alicia might have hidden certain details about her relationship with Sean to avoid upsetting them. The police interviewed Sean's neighbors to see if they had noticed anything unusual, but no significant information emerged. The case seemed to have hit a dead end, with the only option left being to keep pressuring Sean to confess. However, a month after Alicia's disappearance, a surprising twist occurred. Daniel Sylvester, a 31-year-old man who lived nearby, called the police and confessed to killing Alicia, revealing where he had hidden her body. Daniel was a reclusive, unemployed man who lived with his mother in a house adjacent to the Ross family home. Despite living near each other, Daniel and Alicia had never interacted before, but Alicia had seen him a few times and considered him mentally unwell due to his odd behavior. Daniel had severe socialization issues from an early age and harbored deep resentment towards women. He was diagnosed with social anxiety disorder at the age of 8 and had been receiving continuous psychological care, although therapy didn't help much. In his teenage years, he confessed to having dark fantasies of attacking and overpowering a girl, which excited him. Despite these fantasies, specialists were confident that they would remain just in his imagination. After finishing school, Daniel stopped attending therapy sessions and decided not to continue his education. He became a recluse, living in his mother's house, almost completely isolating himself from the outside world. He spent his days sitting in his room, often visiting adult websites, and occasionally ventured out in the evenings to secretly watch his neighbors, peeping into their windows. He especially enjoyed watching when someone was engaged in intimate activities, which excited him. However, Daniel remained a virgin well into his 30s, satisfying himself with solitary activities. The neighbors hardly ever saw him and considered him a harmless guy. However, the mutilated body of Alicia was later found at the location Daniel had indicated, leaving many questions about why the police had overlooked him during their initial investigation. The condition of the remains indicated that the girl had been dealt with extreme cruelty, with injuries that suggested she had been hit by a car. The exact cause of death could not be determined, but at least 3 injuries were incompatible with life. Daniel initially claimed that he had an argument with his neighbor on a bush-covered path between their homes, during which she called him a loser, angering him, and he struck her on the head. When she fell, he kicked her several times in the chest. However, something in his story did not add up, and there were missing details and specifics. Law enforcement had to clarify the circumstances and chronology of events to learn how exactly the girl received such injuries. Daniel spied on his neighbor Alicia and her boyfriend on the fateful evening. He watched them from a window as they were intimate, then moved back to the bushes, but didn't leave. When Alicia's boyfriend left, she saw Daniel spying on her and became angry, yelling at him and calling him a pervert. She then turned to go back into the house, but Daniel snapped, leading to a brutal beating and murder. The word pervert triggered Daniel's rage, reminiscent of childhood taunts from girls. He punched Alicia powerfully on the head, knocking her to the ground, then choked and kicked her, inflicting 33 fractures and extensive internal bleeding. After realizing Alicia was dead, Daniel moved her body to his garage, stripped her naked, and masturbated to relieve tension. He then put the corpse in the trunk of his mother's car and disposed of it in a secluded area outside the city. Upon returning home, he showered, changed clothes, and behaved as if nothing had happened. Daniel confessed to the crime but claimed it was unintentional, citing his mental illness and anger issues. However, the prosecution argued that despite his mental health issues, Daniel was fully aware of the consequences of his actions and acted with merciless intent. The court ordered a psychiatric evaluation, which confirmed Daniel's responsibility for his actions. Daniel was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 16 years. The case of Luz Maria Lopez. Luz Maria Lopez was born on March 17, 1995, in San Cristobal Verapaz, a small town, to a modest family of A. Morales and Brian Lopez. She was the youngest of 2 children, with an older brother named Omar. In infancy, Luz Maria faced a life-threatening intestinal obstruction that required a complex operation. Despite the doctor's uncertainty, her mother's prayers and faith in her recovery paid off, and the surgery was successful. Fortunately, the early surgery did not affect her development. During her school years, Luz Maria was an active and well-rounded student. She participated in gymnastics, athletics, and classical dance, and was a people person who easily made friends. She also excelled academically, particularly in the humanities. After graduation, Luz Maria decided to pursue higher education at a prestigious state university, where she chose to study law, and later specialized in criminalistics, a field that had always fascinated her. When Luz Maria was a student, she accompanied her mother to a car dealership in Coban, the capital of Alta Verapaz, to buy a motorcycle as a 25th birthday gift for her older brother. They met a polite and attentive young consultant named Jorge, who showed them various models and offered recommendations. Although Luz Maria and her mother chose a model, they decided to think it over and consult with the rest of the family before making a decision. Before leaving, Luz Maria gave Jorge her phone number in case they needed further feedback. Shortly after, Jorge called Luz Maria, but instead of discussing the potential purchase, their conversation turned personal. Luz. He continued to call her several times before mustering the courage to invite her to a coffee shop. It was clear that he was smitten with the beautiful brunette, but didn't know how to initiate their acquaintance. Luz Maria was immediately drawn to a handsome young man, and when he asked to meet, she agreed. The only potential obstacle was that he was a year younger, but that didn't deter them. A romantic relationship quickly blossomed, and they both felt an intense connection, believing they had found true love. After just a few months, they decided to take the next step and start living together. Despite their parents' disapproval, they pressed on and got married 6 months later. They kept the wedding intimate, inviting only close friends and family. However, the celebration was almost ruined on the wedding day when the banquet venue encountered an unexpected issue. The couple had to pay a significant amount of extra money to salvage the event, but they were eventually able to go ahead with the ceremony as planned. Jorge is a mysterious figure, and there is limited information available about him in the public domain. What is known is that he was born in 1996 in the town of Santa Catalina Latina, Guatemala. Jorge grew up with his brother Pablo in a low-income family, where financial struggles were a constant reality. As a result, the brothers had to make do with the basics and didn't have the luxury of nice clothes or expensive toys. Contrary to what one might expect, Jorge didn't have big aspirations or ambitions. He never made an effort to study or find a good job, and instead, he took things as they came. Those who knew Jorge described him as introverted, uncommunicative, and sometimes aggressive. He struggled with controlling his emotions, which made it difficult for him to form meaningful relationships or connect with the opposite sex. Despite these challenges, Jorge was determined to win the heart of Luz Maria, the love of his life. He went all out to impress her, and once she agreed to marry him, he was in a hurry to seal the deal, fearing she might change her mind. Luz Maria's parents, however, were not convinced about Jorge from the start. They had reservations about their son-in-law, although they couldn't quite put their finger on what bothered them. Despite their misgivings, they couldn't persuade their daughter to reconsider her decision to marry Jorge. After the wedding, the young couple's marriage quickly became unhappy. The wife, Luz Maria, got pregnant, but she couldn't find a good job because she didn't have a university degree and was inexperienced. No employer wanted to hire an expectant mother with no skills, so she had to settle for casual labor. Meanwhile, her husband, Jorge, lost his job and showed no enthusiasm for finding a new one. When their daughter, Alice, was born, the family's financial situation became dire. Both Jorge and Luz Maria were unemployed and struggling to make ends meet. They couldn't even afford to pay rent, buy food, or purchase basic household necessities. Jorge convinced Luz Maria that they had no choice but to move in with his parents temporarily. Luz Maria was initially hesitant, but with a baby to care for and no other options, she eventually agreed. Her mother, was aware of the family's problems and encouraged Luz Maria to return to her childhood home. But Luz Maria insisted that things would improve with Jorge, and there was no need to worry. Luz Maria's mother visited her daughter and granddaughter at her son-in-law's parents' house, but was met with a disturbing scene. Luz Maria was in a terrible condition, malnourished from only eating once a day. This was partly due to her in-laws not providing her with sufficient food, as they saw her as unemployed. The situation was even more concerning because Luz Maria was breastfeeding her baby, Alice, so her malnutrition could also harm the child's health. The lack of food was just one of the many problems Luz Maria faced in her in-laws' home. She was constantly humiliated and even physically abused by her husband's younger brother. He was irritated by the baby's crying and the presence of children's belongings in the house. He would lash out at Luz Maria, throwing her child's things at her, and on one occasion, even threw a baby bottle at her, hitting Alice, who was in her mother's arms. Jorge refused to stand up for his wife and daughter, treating them as if they were strangers. His mother-in-law, AA, convinced her daughter to take her granddaughter and move back to her parents' house. However, Jorge soon showed up, asking his wife to return and promising to get a job. She agreed, but only if their children could rent an apartment and live separately from his parents. After Luz Maria defended her diploma, she achieved her long-held dream. She landed a job at the city prosecutor's office, earning the respect of her colleagues with her intelligence, talent, and responsibility. As she advanced in her career, the family's financial situation significantly improved, eventually allowing them to afford a car. This improvement was entirely due to the wife's hard work, frugality, and strong reputation among her superiors. Jorge was a selfish and lazy person who relied on his wife, Luz Maria's income instead of working. He had a bad temper, was abusive, and controlled every aspect of Luz Maria's life. He wouldn't let her have friends, go out with colleagues, or even leave the house without him. He constantly checked her phone and social media, and even forbade her from using them. Jorge's behavior was extremely abusive, and he never stood up for Luz Maria when his relatives humiliated or physically abused her. He also used physical violence against her, treating her like his property. Despite this, Luz Maria repeatedly tried to leave him, but he would beg for forgiveness, and she would give him another chance. On December 15, 2020, after a violent fight, Luz Maria left Jorge and went to her mother's house with their 3-year-old daughter Alice. However, Jorge showed up, promising to change and claiming he had found a new job. Luz Maria believed him again and returned to their apartment. In mid-January 2021, Luz Maria called her mother, complaining about Jorge's broken promises and theft, which had left them in a desperate situation. However, Luz Maria stopped responding to calls and messages, which was unusual behavior for her. Her mother grew concerned and went to her workplace, only to find out that Luz Maria was missing. The police were informed, and a nationwide search effort began, with Jorge as the prime suspect. He denied any involvement, claiming he was also searching for his wife. However, the investigation revealed that Jorge was the last person to see Luz Maria alive, and he was the only suspect in her disappearance. Jorge was outraged and frustrated to be the prime suspect in his wife's disappearance, particularly since his own alibi was inconsistent and unclear. He struggled to explain why he hadn't reported her missing to the police on the day she vanished. If he thought she was at her mother's house, why didn't he call or visit her while the police were searching the area and looking for witnesses? On January 22nd, municipal workers made a gruesome discovery while responding to a call about a clogged storm drain. They found a large plastic bag containing a charred human body. Forensic experts confirmed that the body was that of a young woman. Her parents and brother identified the body as Luz Maria Lopez, despite its severe disfigurement. The body was discovered near the prosecutor's office where Luz Maria worked. Although the area lacked surveillance cameras and lighting, pathologists were able to determine that she had suffered severe beating and died from asphyxia. The evidence included internal hemorrhages, fractures sustained while she was alive, and caked blood particles in her nose and mouth. The investigation revealed that Luz Maria's husband, Jorge, was the prime suspect. A disturbing audio recording, sent anonymously by a neighbor, captured a brutal argument between the couple. The recording revealed Luz Maria's desperate screams and cries for help, as well as faint sobs in the background. Unfortunately, the neighbor who made the recording did not call the police or check on the source of the screams. Luz Maria's mother believes that if the neighbor had acted immediately, her daughter might still be alive. The recording was included in the case files, and Luz Maria's mother gave a powerful interview urging citizens to report incidents of domestic violence to the police rather than simply recording or filming them. Thousands of people protested across the country, demanding justice for Luz Maria. Although Jorge was arrested, he maintained his innocence, claiming he drove his wife to work on the day she vanished. However, security footage showed their car heading towards her workplace, but the tinted windows made it impossible to determine how many people were inside. At the couple's rented home, investigators found washed-out blood traces and drag marks, indicating that the brutal crime likely occurred there. This suspicion was strengthened by the discovery of microscopic fragments of burnt flesh in the trunk of the family car. A recent purchase by the couple, a double orthopedic mattress, caught the investigators' attention. Specifically, it was the dense polyethylene wrapping around the mattress that was significant. Comparative analysis revealed that Jorge had used this wrapping to conceal his wife's burnt remains. Several neighbors reported hearing Jorge threaten and insult his wife just days before her sudden disappearance. They recalled him shouting that he would kill her if she left him, and that he would hide her body where no one could find it. Based on the evidence collected by expert criminologists and witness testimonies, the investigation has reconstructed the horrific events of the crime. On the night of January 19, 2021, Jorge committed the murder, just one day after he and his wife had a violent argument. Jorge had a history of uncontrolled outbursts of anger, but this time he completely lost control. He brutally beat his wife, causing her to scream for help. The neighbors heard her cries but failed to call the police. During the beating, Jorge broke his wife's nose and inflicted a severe head injury. Afterwards, he strangled her with his bare hands and attempted to dispose of the body. To do so, he dragged her into the backyard, poured campfire liquid on her, and set her on fire. However, the intense smoke and smell of burning flesh and hair caught him off guard. The most disturbing aspect of the crime is that Jorge committed these atrocities in front of their 3.5-year-old daughter. Although she may not have fully understood what was happening, she witnessed the beating and murder, which was evident from her cries and screams that were recorded. Jorge, who had a basic understanding of forensic science from his wife's textbooks at home, attempted to cover up the crime and create an alibi. He deliberately chose a dark and secluded area without surveillance cameras to dispose of his wife Maria's body in a drainage sewer, escaping detection. The following morning, Jorge drove to Maria's workplace via their usual route, pretending to have dropped her off as he normally did every morning. Then, he began fabricating a search for his wife, contacting her co-workers, friends, and family. During the trial, Jorge's lawyers employed stall tactics to delay proceedings and discredit the investigation. They argued that all evidence and witness testimony was indirect and that there was no concrete proof to conclusively establish Jorge's guilt. Defense attorneys requested that Jorge's detention be changed to house arrest, citing his deep depression over being accused of killing the woman he loved and the mother of his child. However, crucial evidence came from Maria's phone, which had been in Jorge's possession since the crime. On the first day after the murder, Jorge used Maria's phone to send messages to various people, trying to create the illusion that she was still alive. Analysis of the phone's movements showed it was constantly in the same locations as Jorge's phone. The defense argued that Jorge had found his wife's phone and was driving around the city to search for her, but this claim was weakened by the fact that he had sent messages from her phone and even called it from his own phone. Further evidence of Jorge's guilt included the bruises and scratches on his body, documented by experts in photos, which suggested that the victim had put up a struggle. A notable scratch on his neck was particularly telling. While it was not possible to find Jorge's skin cells under the victim's fingernails due to the fire, the cumulative evidence pointed to his guilt. The prosecutor sought the maximum punishment for the defendant despite several contentious issues in the case. However, the court proceedings were frequently delayed. In October 2022, the defendant was finally convicted of brutally murdering his wife. He received a 50-year prison sentence, still maintaining his innocence. Custody of their young daughter, Alice, was awarded to her maternal grandparents. They expressed that caring for their granddaughter has now become the main purpose of their lives. The case of Fasako Sano. Fasako Sano, later known as Sachiko Yamada, was born on November 28, 1980, in Mitsuke, a small town in Niigata Prefecture, Japan. She came from an average-income family and was a beloved child. She attended a local school, enjoyed baseball, and supported the local team. On November 13, 1990, 2 weeks before her 10th birthday, Fasako, then in the 4th grade, was walking home from school after staying late to watch a baseball game. Her parents were aware of her schedule, so they weren't worried when she walked home alone on her usual route. The cold autumn evening was dark, with few pedestrians and cars passing by quickly. Suddenly, a car overtook her and screeched to a halt, swerving in front of her. This sudden event marked a turning point in Fusako's life. Nobuyuki Sat, the kidnapper, was born on July 15, 1962, in Niigata Prefecture, Japan, into a wealthy family. His family's successful business was related to passenger transportation. As the youngest child, Nobuyuki was spoiled and capricious, with no limits set for him. He was emotional and sometimes aggressive when his demands weren't met immediately. His father was 62, and his mother was 37 when he was born, and he had 5 older siblings from his father's previous marriage, but he didn't have a close relationship with them. Nobuyuki's behavior was often erratic and challenging. On one occasion, he even threw a tantrum in a store, physically lashing out at his mother when she refused to buy him another toy. At school, his peculiar behavior and difficulty interacting with others made it hard for him to make friends. His tall stature, which embarrassed him, led to teasing and unkind nicknames, causing him to slouch to try to minimize his height. Despite his father's efforts to provide him with a comfortable and spacious room in their luxurious European-style home, Nobuyuki was unhappy and afraid to be alone in the room. His restless behavior and irrational fears prompted his parents to seek professional help from a doctor. The boy was first examined at a regular hospital and then sent to see a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist diagnosed him with several anxiety disorders, including a fear of the dark, a fear of germs and dirt, and a unique combination of 2 other phobias. On one hand, he had autophobia, which is a fear of being alone. On the other hand, he also had sociophobia, which is a fear of social interactions. This meant that he was equally afraid of being by himself and of being around other people. Nobuki was a loner throughout his life. Despite being attractive, he never had a girlfriend in high school, nor did he have any friends. His peers shunned him, and he became an outcast. As a result, he took out his frustrations on his elderly parents, who always forgave him and tried to make him happy with gifts and money. As an adult, Nobuki struggled to hold down a job. He frequently got into trouble, clashed with coworkers, and neglected his responsibilities, making him unemployable. He would often leave work early for frivolous reasons, such as feeling sad because it was raining. On one occasion, he intentionally hurt a female colleague, likely to get her attention. The incident was deemed an accident, but Nobuki was immediately fired. He never found another job and relied on his parents for financial support. Over time, Nobuki became increasingly reclusive, rarely leaving his room, and his conflicts with his parents escalated. After a particularly heated argument, Nobuki set a fire in his own home, which nearly destroyed the entire house and its occupants. After being sent to a psychiatric clinic for compulsory treatment, Sato was diagnosed with manic depressive disorder, uncontrollable outbursts of aggression, and signs of misogyny, which involves intense dislike and hatred towards women. He stayed in the hospital for over a month before being discharged, deemed no longer a threat to others. For a while, Nobuyuki seemed calm, and even started rebuilding and expanding his partially burned house. However, his efforts were short-lived, and he eventually abandoned the construction. As time passed, Sato became increasingly withdrawn and isolated, spending most of his time alone in his room watching TV. He started to shut out his parents, refusing to let them enter not only his room, but also the entire second floor. If they violated this boundary, he would lash out at them violently, shouting and threatening them with death. In the spring of 1989, Nobuyuki began taking walks near a local school, where he would closely observe the female students. Initially, he kept his distance and didn't attempt to approach or contact anyone. However, one day, he suddenly grabbed a 9-year-old girl at the school gate, threw her over his shoulder, and ran to his nearby parked car. The incident occurred in front of other children, who immediately shouted for help. A school security guard and bystanders quickly responded, rescuing her and detaining Nobuyuki before the police arrived. Unable to explain his motives, Nobuyuki was charged with attempting to commit violent acts against a minor. He faced a potential prison sentence, but during his trial in August 1989, Nobuyuki received only a year's probation. According to some reports, his father's connections and payment of a large sum of money influenced the outcome. Furthermore, Nobuyuki's name was mysteriously removed from the database of prosecuted criminals soon after. Here, his father's efforts also played a role, but ultimately backfired. The elderly man worked tirelessly to clear his son's name, but in the process, he suffered a heart attack and died in the hospital. Soar was overcome with shame and regret for raising a monstrous individual. A year and a half after the initial failed attempt, the 28-year-old Soar kidnapped a girl in Nagata. Despite his calm demeanor, he remained under the radar of the police, and the incident near the school in the spring of 1989 was all but forgotten. On November 13, 1990, Nobuyuki Sato went for a drive around the city, eventually finding himself on a deserted road in the evening. There, he came across 9-year-old Fusako Sano, who was walking home from a delayed school event. The area was isolated, with no people or cars in sight, leaving Fusako with no one to turn to for help. Sato suddenly stopped his car in front of Fusako, got out, and grabbed her while holding a knife. He threatened to slit her throat if she screamed or tried to escape. He then forced her into the trunk of his car and drove further down the road. Eventually, he stopped in a vacant lot, where he tied Fusako's hands and feet and taped her mouth shut. Once night fell, Sato drove back to his house, taking Fusako out of the trunk and carrying her to his room through an unfinished part of the building to avoid detection. He then left his room, re-entering through the front door as he normally would. Back upstairs, he threatened Fusako with the knife, ordering her to be silent. He tied her to the bed, warning her that if she tried to leave the room, look out the window, scream or cry, he would kill her and dispose of her body in the ocean where it would never be found. She was terrified and obeyed the kidnapper's every command, still holding on to hope that he would show mercy and release her. Meanwhile, the search for the missing girl began when Fusako failed to return home from school. Her parents grew worried because they knew she had planned to stay late to watch a baseball game, but since it was already dark outside and she was long overdue, they knew something was amiss. Initially, Fusako's parents tried to locate her on their own, retracing her usual route from school to home, but their efforts yielded nothing. As night began to fall, they sought the police's help, hoping that swift action would lead to her prompt recovery. The police launched a search operation, which was soon bolstered by dozens of local volunteers who joined the effort by the next morning. The search for the missing girl continued the next day, with over 200 people involved. They thoroughly searched the area, posted flyers with her picture, and talked to people who might have seen something. Interestingly, Nobuyuki lived close to her school and the police station. Moreover, he had a history of attempting to kidnap her, yet he was not considered a suspect. Thanks to his father's efforts to keep his son's name out of the criminal database, the search lasted for months, covering many areas, including empty buildings, vehicles, and highways. Despite the extensive search, no leads or clues about her disappearance were found. Investigators explored various possibilities, including the unlikely suggestion that North Korean agents might have been involved in the abduction. As time passed, The search for Fusako Sano was unsuccessful, and she remained a captive of Nobuyuki's obsession. Initially, Fusako was terrified and obediently followed her captor's orders, hoping that he would eventually show mercy and release her. However, Nobuyuki had no intention of letting her go, at least not for the first few months. To maintain control, Nobuyuki bound Fusako's hands and feet extremely tightly, restricting blood flow and causing her to lose feeling in her limbs. He punished even the slightest disobedience or noise with a stun gun, beat her on the head and body, or threatened her with a knife. Despite his cruel treatment, Nobuyuki never sexually exploited Fusako during her captivity. Instead, he viewed her as a living toy or pet, someone to talk to and dominate. Nobuyuki would sit with Fusako, feeding her 1 or 2 meals a day, prepared by his mother who lived on the first floor. Due to her severely restricted diet, she became extremely weak and malnourished. The man prohibited her from leaving her bed, forcing her to use plastic bags as a toilet, which he would then dispose of in the unfinished part of the house. Once a month, he bathed her in a basin, cutting her hair and nails himself, and dressing her in his own tattered clothes. Despite her obedient behavior, the kidnapper regularly beat her for entertainment, practicing various fighting techniques on her. After several years, Fusako's spirit was finally crushed, and she surrendered to her tormentor's demands, no longer attempting to escape or even glance out the window. Eventually, the man stopped restraining her when he left the room, leaving the door unlocked. He would simply cover her with blankets or towels, making it seem as though no one was underneath. Over time, Nobuyuki began to permit Fusako to listen to the radio and watch TV with him, but only if it was something that interested him, such as Scottish programs or sports matches. He also brought her comic books, which he loved. These were the only things Fusako had read during her years of confinement. For nearly a decade, a young girl was held captive in a small room, never speaking to anyone or leaving her confinement. She was mostly bedridden and had lost all will to resist, escape, or signal for help. Her captive was Nobuyuki, a violent son who lived with his mother on the first floor of the house. His mother was too afraid to enter his room, fearing physical harm if she disobeyed his rules. When Nobuyuki took she prisoner, he forbade his mother from visiting the second floor. On one occasion, even physically pushed her down the stairs when she tried to do so. In 1996, an elderly woman, Mrs. Sato, sought help from the police, alleging domestic violence by her son, who had physically abused her, forced her to follow his rules, and psychologically tormented her. However, the police were reluctant to intervene, convincing her to withdraw her statement and resolve the issue on her own. On 2 separate occasions, Mrs. Sato also sought help from a public health center, complaining about her son's aggressive behavior and requesting his hospitalization in a psychiatric facility. Unfortunately, her pleas were dismissed, and she was advised to persuade her son to seek help voluntarily. 4 years later, in January 2000, after enduring yet another brutal beating, Mrs. Sato made a desperate call to the hospital, requesting a medical team and law enforcement to be sent to her home. She was being held captive by her son, who had tied her up and used a taser on her multiple times. The authorities finally responded to a pensioner's complaints and visited her home. When they arrived with an ambulance and police car, her son Nobuyuki became agitated, aggressive, and resistant. Due to his behavior, the police had to restrain him with handcuffs, and medics administered a large dose of sedatives. The elderly woman confessed that she lived in fear of her son, whose behavior had become increasingly aggressive and unpredictable. She revealed that she had avoided the second floor of their home for years because her son had threatened to kill her if she went up there. The police decided to investigate the second floor and Nobuyuki's room. Upon entering, they found a pile of blankets on the bed that seemed to move slightly. When they pulled back the blankets, they were shocked to discover a thin, pale, and exhausted girl hidden underneath. When questioned, she quietly identified herself and explained that she had been kidnapped on her way home from school a long time ago. After the shocking discovery, Nayuki's mother was questioned in the room about the captive girl, but she appeared genuinely surprised and denied any knowledge of her presence in their home, claiming she only knew about her son and herself living there. The captive corroborated this, stating she had never seen Nayuki's mother before. Nuki confessed to the police that he had been immediately attracted to Fusako when he saw her walking along the road, and he wanted to take her home with him. He claimed to have taken good care of her, providing for her needs, washing and dressing her, and reading her comic books. Although he admitted to punishing her when she disobeyed, he insisted that he treated her with affection, like a friend. Nuki believed that Fusako had feelings for him and was happy to stay with him. Nuki enjoyed talking to Fusako, discussing topics like soccer, music, and comic books, even though she didn't respond. He noted that he never locked his bedroom door, and yet Fusako never tried to escape, leading him to believe that she was content living with him. The medical examination revealed that Nuki was capable of understanding his actions despite his mental disorder, and he could face trial. His mother could be considered an accomplice because she regularly bought feminine hygiene products for her son, which might have raised suspicions. However, the fact that she consistently reached out to the police and medical institutions for help was taken into account. The case drew widespread attention before the trial began, and the local police faced severe criticism. They had previously prosecuted Nuki for attempting to kidnap a schoolgirl, but they failed to prevent him from carrying out his plan. As a result, the local police chief and the head of the regional police department were removed from their positions. In May 2000, Nuki was put on trial, where prosecutors examined every aspect of his actions to seek the maximum punishment. As a result, Nuki was found guilty and received a 14-year prison sentence. Nuki was released in the spring of 2015, but his mother had passed away by then, leaving him with no living relatives. Unfortunately, he was found dead in a small rented room in early 2017, and the cause of his death remains unknown. Fusako's life was devastated by the ordeal. When she was finally discovered, she was extremely weak, malnourished, and had severe muscle atrophy. She had developed a stutter, was afraid of sunlight, and had almost lost her ability to communicate. Her parents didn't even recognize their own daughter when they saw her for the first time in nearly a decade. After the ordeal, Fusako took around a year to regain her physical strength, but her mental recovery was much slower. She suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, became reclusive, and her cognitive development was stunted at a level comparable to a 9 to 10-year-old child. To escape the media frenzy, her parents moved her to a new town, where she adopted the alias Sachiko Yamada and refused all press interviews. Over time, Sachiko gradually built relationships, developed a passion for photography, and even managed to pass her driver's license exam. Tragically, in 2007, she experienced another devastating blow when her father accidentally drowned in front of her during a family outing to a pond.